The first time I saw a sheriff's deputy walk across my pasture, I thought one of my cows had gotten loose again. The second time, I realized he was there because my new neighbor had filed another complaint. But the third time he came to my land, it was to put her in handcuffs, and I can still remember the way the sun hit the metal when he locked them around her wrists. Now, before anybody thinks I'm the kind of man who enjoys watching someone get arrested, let me be clear. I was raised better than that. My dad taught me to shake hands, fix fences, mind my own business, and leave people with a little more grace than they gave you. But there are some folks in this world who do not understand peace unless the law is standing beside them with a notepad and a pair of cuffs. My name is Mason Reed, and at the time this all happened, I was living on 36 acres outside a little town in southern Missouri, the kind of place where everybody knows what truck you drive, what church your grandmother went to, and whether your tomatoes came in early that year. The land had been in my family since my great-grandfather bought it with money he made cutting timber. And it was not fancy land, not the postcard kind, with white horses and a perfect red barn. It was working land, uneven, stubborn, muddy after rain, beautiful in the morning, and hard on your back by sundown. I grew sweet corn, pumpkins, peppers, and beans, kept chickens, a few dairy goats, 2 old horses nobody wanted anymore, and a small herd of cattle that mostly minded their own business unless the grass looked greener on the wrong side of a gate. I sold produce at the Saturday farmers market, fixed my own equipment when I could, paid someone smarter when I could not, and for the most part, I was happy. I did not have much use for drama, and out where I lived, that was kind of the point. People moved to the country for quiet, or at least that is what I thought until Evelyn Shaw bought the place east of me. The old Carter house had sat empty for almost 2 years after Mrs. Carter passed, a pale blue farmhouse with wraparound porches, pecan trees, and a view of my south pasture. I figured whoever bought it would either be retired or looking to raise kids somewhere with fewer sirens, but Evelyn showed up in a black SUV that looked like it had never touched gravel before, wearing sunglasses big enough to hide half her face and shoes that sank into the driveway the second she stepped out. She was maybe late 40s, sharp haircut, sharper voice, and she introduced herself like she was announcing a merger. She said she had practiced real estate law in St. Louis for 20 years, had recently simplified her life, and planned to turn the Carter place into a private countryside retreat, which sounded harmless enough, although the way she looked past me at my barn told me she was not seeing charm, she was seeing a problem. I tried to be friendly. I brought over a basket of tomatoes and a jar of honey from a friend down the road, and she took it with 2 fingers like I had handed her something damp. "That's very thoughtful," she said, smiling without warmth. "I do hope we can be respectful of each other's property values out here." That was the first warning sign, but I ignored it because sometimes city people just talk like that when they are nervous. The second warning sign came 3 mornings later, when my rooster, Buckshot, did what roosters have been doing since the beginning of time and crowed at sunrise. I was in the barn pouring feed when Evelyn came marching across the grass in a cream pantsuit, holding her phone in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, looking like she had been personally attacked by the concept of agriculture. "Mr. Reed," she called, not asked, called like I was an employee late for a meeting. "Do you understand that noise ordinances exist for a reason?" I looked at Buckshot, who looked back at me with all the concern of a feathered criminal, and I said, "Ma'am, that's a rooster." She blinked at me. "I'm aware of what it is." "Then you're aware that it crows." Her mouth tightened. "Not at 5:30 in the morning beside a residential property." I remember wiping my hands on my jeans and taking a breath because I could already feel the conversation becoming the kind you lose by participating. I explained that this was zoned agricultural, that the rooster had been there longer than both of us, and that mornings on a farm came with animal sounds, tractors, feed trucks, and occasionally me yelling at a gate that would not latch. Evelyn listened like a judge letting a defendant incriminate himself, then said, "I'm going to document this." I almost laughed, but something about her face stopped me. She meant it. After that, the complaints came like weather. If the goats bleated too loud, she called the county. If I spread composted manure on the far vegetable plot, she emailed environmental services. If my cattle wandered near the fence line, not through it, not onto her land, just near it, she called the sheriff and said there were large, aggressive animals threatening her safety. Deputy Lyle, who had known me since I was 16 and once pulled me over for driving my dad's tractor on the shoulder without lights, would show up, rub the back of his neck and say, "Mason, I know, just gotta write it down." I never blamed him. He had a job. But every visit felt like somebody dropping a small stone into my chest. At first, I tried kindness. I invited Evelyn to walk the property line with me so she could see the fencing was solid. She refused. I offered to move the compost pile farther from her side. She said the whole operation was visually and atmospherically offensive. I even brought her a dozen eggs one afternoon, thinking maybe food could soften what common sense could not, and she left them on her porch until they spoiled in the heat. The thing I slowly came to understand was that Evelyn did not just dislike the farm. She disliked what it represented. She had bought a fantasy, the peaceful country estate, the curated rustic life, golden fields without flies, barns without smell, animals without sound, and I was the ugly little fact ruining the brochure. I was not a neighbor to her, I was a defect. The real trouble started in late April, when I decided to dig a pond in the low section behind my pumpkin field. My father had talked about doing it for years because that corner stayed wet anyway, and with summers getting hotter, I needed a reliable water source for irrigation. I hired an engineer, got the permits, checked drainage, called the county, did everything by the book because I knew Evelyn was watching. The contractor came out on a Tuesday morning with a backhoe and 2 dump trucks, and by noon, Evelyn was standing at the edge of my field waving a folder like she had just discovered evidence in a murder trial. "You do not have my consent to alter this landscape," she said. I shut the tractor off and climbed down slowly. "I don't need your consent to dig on my land. That pond will destroy my view. Your view is across my pasture. It will attract mosquitoes, so does rain. It will lower my property value. Evelyn, with all due respect, you bought a house next to a farm. The farm is not new." Her eyes went flat then, and I saw something hard settle behind them. "You people always say that like it excuses everything." I should have walked away right there, but I was tired, and I said, "And you people always move out here thinking the rest of us are props in your quiet little movie." For a second, neither of us spoke. The backhoe idled behind me, coughing diesel into the warm air, and Evelyn looked at me with the kind of calm that does not mean peace. It means planning. "You'll be hearing from my attorney," she said. I almost said, "I thought you were the attorney," but I kept that one to myself. 2 days later, I was served with a temporary injunction trying to stop the pond construction. She claimed the project was reckless, harmful, invasive, a nuisance, a threat to her enjoyment of her property, and my personal favorite, an intentional campaign of rural intimidation. Rural intimidation. That was her phrase for a man digging a pond in a wet field his grandfather had paid taxes on for 60 years. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night with the papers spread out beside a cold cup of coffee, feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Not anger exactly, not yet. More like disbelief turning slowly into dread. Because when a person like Evelyn decides to make your life expensive, being right does not protect you from the bill. I called a lawyer in Springfield named Daniel Price, a calm, dry man who wore suspenders and spoke like every sentence had been sanded smooth. He read the filing, sighed, and said, "She probably won't win, but she can make this annoying." I asked how annoying. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "Annoying in billable hours." And that was how a simple farm pond became the beginning of a war I never asked for, one that would cost me sleep, money, patience, and eventually almost half a season's crop. But at that point I still believed Evelyn was just trying to scare me. I did not yet understand that some people do not stop when they lose. They just start looking for a bigger weapon. At first I tried to treat it like a bad storm, something loud and inconvenient that would eventually pass if I kept my head down. But the thing about storms is they do not usually send certified letters, and Evelyn Shaw sent plenty. Every week there was something new in my mailbox, a notice, a complaint, a copy of an email she had sent to the county, sometimes written in that polished legal language that makes nonsense sound expensive, sometimes handwritten in blue ink with little underlines where she wanted me to feel especially guilty. She accused me of creating runoff hazards, disturbing wildlife corridors, reducing rural aesthetics, and once, I swear to God, she wrote that my ducks had developed a pattern of hostile movement toward her fence line. Ducks. Hostile movement. Daniel Price, my lawyer, told me not to respond to her directly anymore, which was harder than I expected because there is something deeply unnatural about standing 10 feet from a person who is ruining your day and pretending they are not there. I would see her on her porch with binoculars, watching my contractor measure drainage, watching me haul feed, watching my nephew Eli help me mend the east gate, and she always had that same look. Like she was not observing a neighbor, she was gathering evidence. The pond project got delayed almost 3 months while the court sorted through her claims. 3 months might not sound like much to somebody sitting in an office, but on a farm, 3 months is not time. It is weather, it is planting windows, it is diesel, seed, labor, markets, bills, and the kind of stress that follows you into bed and sits there breathing beside you. I had already paid the contractor a deposit, already bought irrigation fittings, already mapped out the pumpkin field around where the pond would drain, and now everything was frozen because Evelyn wanted a better view from her breakfast nook. What made it worse was how she started playing victim around town. She went to the feed store one morning and told old Pete at the counter that I was retaliating against her for being a single woman living alone. Pete called me before I even finished unloading hay. "Mason," he said, "you got any idea why that lawyer lady says you're trying to terrorize her with poultry?" I just stood there with a bale hook in my hand, staring at the barn wall, and I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because if I did not laugh, I was going to put my fist through something I still needed. That was the part people do not understand about dealing with someone like Evelyn. It is not one big explosion at first, it is 1,000 little cuts, each one small enough that if you complain, you sound dramatic, but together they make you bleed. My sister Claire came by every Thursday with her kids, and even she noticed I was changing. I was shorter with people, quieter at dinner, less patient with the animals, and one evening while we sat on the tailgate watching the sun drop behind the soybean fields, she said, "You know Dad would tell you not to let that woman move into your head." I said, "Dad never had to pay a lawyer by the hour because somebody hated frogs before they even existed." Claire smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "No, but Dad did know pride when he saw it, and that woman is full of it." She was right. Evelyn was proud, but not the healthy kind, not the kind that comes from building something. Hers was the kind that needed other people smaller so she could feel tall. The court hearing finally happened in July, in a county courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old paper. Evelyn arrived in a charcoal suit with 2 folders, 1 tablet, and a younger attorney from her old firm, who looked like he had been shipped in from a catalogue called Confident Men with Expensive Watches. I came in, wearing my only decent jacket, boots cleaned the best I could manage, Daniel beside me with his suspenders and quiet expression. Evelyn did not look at me when I sat down. She looked past me like I was furniture. Her lawyer argued that my pond would permanently interfere with her enjoyment of her property, that I had acted with disregard for a neighboring landowner, that the rural zoning did not give me unlimited freedom to create hazards. Daniel stood up after him, adjusted his glasses, and said in the driest voice I had ever heard, "Your Honor, my client is attempting to dig a permitted agricultural pond in a naturally wet depression on agricultural land. The opposing party appears to be asking this court to recognize a legal right to scenery she does not own." I nearly coughed, trying not to laugh. The judge did not laugh either, but one corner of his mouth moved just enough to let me know he had heard it. Then came the permits, the drainage report, the zoning records, the county approval, the old map showing that Low Corner had held seasonal water since before I was born. Evelyn's side had complaints, photographs taken from her porch, speculation about insects, and one printed picture of my geese that she claimed proved waterfowl expansion was already becoming a nuisance. Daniel looked at that photo for a long second, then said, "Those are geese, Your Honor, not a militia." That time somebody in the back did snort. The judge ruled in my favor the same afternoon. He said I had complied with county requirements, that Evelyn had not shown actual harm, and that property rights did not include controlling lawful activity on neighboring agricultural land simply because it was unpleasant to look at. I should have felt pure relief, and part of me did. But when I turned to leave, I caught Evelyn's face. She was sitting very still, lips pressed together, cheeks pale, and her eyes were not embarrassed, not sorry, not even defeated. They were cold. Outside the courthouse, she walked past me and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "You'll regret making me look foolish." I stopped on the steps. Daniel put a hand on my arm, not hard, just enough to remind me that silence was cheaper than a response. So I let her walk away. The pond got dug 2 weeks later. It was not even dramatic in the end, just machines moving dirt, water slowly filling in after a rain, ducks acting like I had built them a 5-star resort. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, Because Evelyn had lost in court, lost clearly, lost publicly, and surely even she would not want to keep spending money on a fight she could not win. But losing did not humble her. It focused her. She stopped trying to block the pond and started trying to suffocate everything around it. When I put up a small equipment shed, she reported it as an unpermitted commercial structure, even though I had the permit taped in the window before the lumber arrived. When I planted a row of apple trees along the south fence, she claimed I was intentionally obstructing her sunrise view, which was impressive because the sun did not rise in the south. When I hosted a small fall field trip for the elementary school, she called the sheriff about traffic, even though there were 6 minivans and a bus parked entirely on my gravel lane. The strangest part was how calm she became in person. She stopped yelling. She stopped marching over in heels. Instead, she smiled, waved from her porch, and let the paperwork do the biting. That scared me more. By September, I was behind on sleep and behind on money, but the pumpkin crop looked good, maybe the best I had ever had. Pumpkins were not my biggest crop, but they were the one that made the place feel alive. Families came out on weekends. Kids picked the crooked ones. Moms took pictures by the hay bales. Dads pretended they did not care and then bought cider donuts anyway. My mother used to say pumpkins were proof that the earth had a sense of humor, all those bright orange faces growing out of dirt. I needed that crop that year, not just financially, but emotionally. I needed one thing Evelyn had not managed to poison. Then, one afternoon, a man named Curtis Hale pulled into my driveway in a white pickup with a magnet on the door that said Boundary and Land Services. He told me he had been hired by Ms. Shaw to conduct a private survey along the East Line. That was not unusual by itself. People can survey their land, but something in my gut tightened. I walked with him to the fence, asked what prompted it, and he gave me that careful professional shrug people use when they know more than they want to say. Property line dispute, he said. She believes the existing fence is inaccurate. I told him that fence had been there for decades and matched every county map I had ever seen. He said old fences were not always legal boundaries. He was not rude, and I could tell he did not want trouble. But as he set his markers, I saw Evelyn on her porch, watching us through those same binoculars. And for the first time in months, she looked pleased. A week later, she sent me a letter claiming that nearly 2 acres of my east pasture, including the corner of the pumpkin field, encroached on her property. Daniel reviewed it and said her claim was weak, based on a selective reading of an old deed description and a survey that needed to be challenged. But he also said we should not ignore it. Do not touch anything near that line until we get our own survey, he told me. So I hired another surveyor, which meant more money, more waiting, more feeling like I had to prove I owned land my family had walked for generations. The new survey was scheduled for the following Monday. Evelyn knew that because Daniel had notified her lawyer. She knew we were contesting it. She knew nothing was settled. And still, on Friday afternoon, I came home from delivering crates of peppers to the market and heard the sound before I saw anything. Heavy engines, metal tracks, men shouting over diesel. At first, my brain refused to understand it because that kind of noise does not belong in your field unless you invited it there. I drove faster down the lane, dust kicking up behind me, and when I rounded the barn, I saw 2 bulldozers at the east fence. One section was already down, posts snapped, wire twisted, dirt rolled open like a wound. And beyond it, where my pumpkins had been sitting fat and orange in the September sun, there were tire tracks, crushed vines, split fruit, and mud. Evelyn stood near the fallen fence in a navy suit, one hand resting on a survey stake, sunglasses on, smiling like she had finally found the bigger weapon. I got out of the truck so fast I left the door hanging open. "Shut it down," I yelled. One of the operators looked over, confused. Evelyn lifted a paper in the air and called back, "This portion is my property, Mr. Reed. I am merely clearing an unlawful encroachment." I could barely hear her over the engines, but I saw her smile widen when she said it. I walked toward her, my boots sinking into the torn ground, my chest so tight it hurt. "You know this is disputed," I said. "You know the survey is being challenged Monday." She tilted her head, calm as Sunday tea. "Then I suppose you should have challenged it sooner." Behind her, another fence post cracked, and one of my old horses started screaming from the upper pasture, panicked by the noise. That sound cut through me more than the engines. I looked at the crushed pumpkins, the broken fence, the animals running, and something inside me went perfectly still. Not peaceful, not calm. Still, Evelyn had mistaken patience for weakness, manners for fear, and the law for a toy she could swing at anybody who embarrassed her. I pulled out my phone, called Deputy Lyle directly, and when he answered, I said, "Tom, I need you at my farm right now. Evelyn Shaw is destroying my property." Then I looked her dead in the eyes while I said the next part. "And this time, I want charges." Deputy Lyle got there in less than 15 minutes, and by then I had made the bulldozer operators stop, not because they respected me, but because I stood in front of the lead machine and refused to move, which I do not recommend unless you are angry enough to forget you are not made of steel. I'm not made of steel. Evelyn kept telling them not to listen to me, waving that survey like it was a deed from God himself. But the men looked uncomfortable now, because there is a big difference between clearing land for a paying client and realizing you might be standing in the middle of a crime scene. When Tom Lyle stepped out of his cruiser, he did not come in hot. He never did. He just adjusted his hat, looked at the broken fence, the crushed pumpkins, the panicked horses, then looked at Evelyn and said, "Mom, I need you to step away from the equipment." Evelyn gave him that thin courtroom smile. "Deputy, this is a civil property matter, and I have documentation authorizing removal of an encroachment." Tom looked at the paper, then looked at me. "Mason, your survey is scheduled Monday, right?" I nodded. "And she was notified through counsel?" I nodded. "And she was notified through counsel." I nodded again. Evelyn cut in, sharp as a knife. "That does not suspend my rights." Tom handed the paper back to her. "Maybe not, but it also does not give you permission to destroy disputed property before a boundary is verified." That was the first time I saw her confidence twitch, just a little right at the corner of her mouth. She started talking faster after that, throwing out phrases like adverse possession and mistaken boundary and lawful abatement. But Tom was not Daniel Price. He was not there to debate case law. He was there because a fence was down and thousands of dollars of crop were lying in the dirt. He walked the line, took pictures, spoke with the operators, and one of them, poor guy, admitted Evelyn had told them the dispute was already settled and that I had refused to remove my fence voluntarily. I watched her face as he said it. That smile disappeared piece by piece. Then Daniel arrived because I had called him too, and behind him came Curtis Hale, the surveyor Evelyn had hired, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Daniel asked him one question, calm as could be. "Did your report authorize physical removal of improvements prior to resolution of a contested boundary?" Curtis swallowed and said, "No, sir, it did not." Evelyn snapped, "You work for me." Curtis looked at the ground and said, "I was hired to perform a survey, Miss Shaw, not to tell a bulldozer crew to clear land under dispute." That was the moment the whole thing shifted. You could feel it, like the air before lightning. Evelyn had spent months hiding behind polished language, behind letters and filings and complaints. But now the mud was real, the damage was real, and there were witnesses standing around who did not belong to her. Tom turned to her and said, Miss Cart, Shaw, at this time you are being detained while we sort out criminal trespass and property damage." She actually laughed once, a small, shocked sound, like the idea itself was vulgar. "You cannot be serious." Tom said, "I am." She looked at me then, and for the first time since she moved in, I do not think she saw a nuisance or a farmhand or some local man she could push around. I think she saw the edge of the cliff she had walked herself toward. "Tell him," she said to me, and her voice cracked just enough that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Tell him this is unnecessary." I looked past her at my field. There were pumpkins split open in the sun, vines ripped out by the roots, fence wire twisted around a broken post, and my old horse Blue still pacing at the far gate, blowing hard through his nose. I thought about every morning I had opened the mailbox, afraid of what she had sent next, every hour of legal fees, every time I had swallowed words because I was trying to be decent. Then I looked back at her and said, "You should have stopped when the judge told you no." Tom put her in cuffs right there beside the fallen fence. She kept her chin up at first, still trying to look offended instead of afraid. But when the second cruiser pulled in and one of the operators gave a statement, she went quiet. That silence stayed with me, not because it was peaceful, but because it felt like the first honest thing she had given me in months. The case dragged into winter, because of course it did. Evelyn hired a different attorney, one with a voice like polished stone, and they tried to paint the whole thing as a misunderstanding, an emotional reaction to years of neighbor conflict, a simple survey dispute that had gotten out of hand. Daniel did not raise his voice once. He brought receipts. Permits, maps, emails, notices from our office challenging the survey, photographs from before and after, statements from the equipment crew, and the final corrected survey, which showed exactly what I already knew. That fence line was mine. The pumpkin field was mine. The land she cleared was mine. When the judge read the ruling, Evelyn stood very still, hands folded, eyes locked forward. She got probation, a criminal trespass conviction, a restraining order keeping her off my property, a heavy fine, and restitution for the fence, the crop loss, the livestock stress, and the interruption to my farm business. It was not movie justice. There was no dramatic speech, no thunder, no crowd clapping. Just a tired judge, a stack of papers, and one woman finally learning that being fluent in the law does not mean you own it. The money did not come easy. It never does. Her homeowner's insurance wanted nothing to do with intentional damage. Her legal bills were bad, and by spring the Carter place had a for sale sign in front of it. I saw her one last time on a grey morning in April. She was loading boxes into that same black SUV, only now the tires were muddy and the shine was gone. She did not wave. I did not either. For a second I wondered what kind of life makes a person need control that badly, what disappointment or loneliness or pride turns a neighbor into an enemy. Then Blue nudged my shoulder from behind, looking for the apple slice in my pocket, and I remembered I had living things to care for, not ghosts to chase. That fall, the new fence was up, the pond was full, the ducks were ridiculous, and the pumpkin field came back better than ever. Families returned on Saturdays. Kids ran between the rows, and one little girl picked a lopsided pumpkin from the exact patch Evelyn had destroyed and told me it was perfect because it had survived. I did not correct her. Maybe that is what justice feels like sometimes. Not revenge, not victory, just standing on your own land after somebody tried to erase you and realizing you are still there. Now I know some folks will say I should have handled it privately, that neighbors should talk things out, that pressing charges was too far. Maybe you believe that. Maybe you think Evelyn was just protecting what she thought was hers. But I keep coming back to one simple thing. She had every chance to stop before the bulldozers started moving. So I want to know what you think. Was I right to push for charges, or should I have let the civil courts handle it quietly? Drop your take in the comments, because out in the country, fences matter, but respect matters more, and when someone tears down both, sooner or later, somebody has to draw the line.